So in this video, we will be seeing about dural venous sinuses. Now before moving into that, all the parts of the central nervous system, that is the brain and spinal cord, has three layers of meninges surrounding them. What are the three layers? The innermost layer that immediately covers the brain and spinal cord is called as the pia mater. The next layer after that is called as the arachnoid. Okay, between these two, between the arachnoid and pia, we have the subarachnoid space. And the third layer, outermost layer, is the dura mater. Now, I told you that brain and spinal cord is covered by the meninges. But there is a unique feature in the meninges that covers the brain, okay, or the cranial meninges. That is, the dura mater has two layers in it. Okay, one layer is very close to the bone. So it is called as endosteal layer. The other layer is called as the meningeal layer. The outer layer of dura mater that is closely associated with the bone is called as the endosteal layer, whereas the second layer, the inner layer, that is called as the meningeal layer. Okay. Now this meningeal layer will form folds. What is the purpose of these folds? Okay, it separates the two hemispheres of cerebellum, and it helps in keeping the brain in position during rotational movements. Apart from that, it also has space for venous drainage. Okay, so all the veins of the brain will be drained into a space inside these folds called as the dural venous sinuses. Okay, so the dural venous folds will contain the dural venous sinuses within it. Okay, now with this, I told you that the cranial region, dura mater, has two components. This endosteal is the outer and meningeal layer is the inner layer. Okay, the second is the arachnoid. Between these two, arachnoid and pia, we have the subarachnoid space. Okay, pia is the innermost layer of meninges. This immediately covers the brain. Okay, now I told you there are dural folds formed by the inner layer. Okay, inner layer of dura mater is called as the meningeal layer. Okay, there are four folds in total. Okay, the first fold is called as the falx cerebri. The second one is called as the tentorium cerebelli. The third one is called as falx cerebelli, and the fourth one is called as diaphragma cellae. Now the names are based on its shape and where it is. Okay, falx means sickle. Okay, so it is sickle shaped. Both the cerebri and cerebelli are sickle shaped. Now one is called as cerebri because it is present between the two cerebral hemispheres. The other one is called as cerebelli because that is present between the two cerebellar hemispheres. Now the next, tentorium. Okay, it is tent shaped. Okay, it forms a tent above the cerebellum. Okay, it forms the roof above the cerebellum. So it is called as tentorium cerebelli. The next one is called as diaphragma cellae. In the body of sphenoid, we've seen some parts here called as the tuberculum cellae, dorsum cellae. This diaphragm is related to that region. Okay, it is circular shape, so it is called as a diaphragm. Okay, these are the four dural venous folds or the dural folds. Okay, first we'll see about the first fold, that is called as the falx cerebri. Now, I already told you that it is sickle shaped. The location of this fold is between the two cerebrum. Okay, remember, falx cerebri is present between the two cerebrum. Now, this image, this represents the posterior view of the brain. Okay, so you're looking at the occipital lobe here. Okay, this is the occipital lobe, and this is the right and the left hemisphere of the brain, and these are the cerebellum. Okay, with this orientation, I'll name a fissure. Okay, this region consists of a fissure between the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. There is a fissure called as the median longitudinal fissure. Okay, that is the location where the falx cerebri is situated. Okay, I'll repeat again. The falx cerebri is situated in the median longitudinal fissure. Where is this fissure present? In the midline. okay, in the sagittal plane. The next thing is about its parts. It has a apex, base, two borders, upper and lower, and two surfaces. Okay, the apex is attached to frontal crest and crista galli. Now, where is crista galli present? This region. Okay, in what bone is this? That is the ethmoid bone. We already saw that the ethmoid bone, these dots represent the cribriform plate. In the midline, there is a raised part called as the crista galli. That is the anterior attachment where the apex is attached. Corresponding to that, in the frontal bone, there is a midline crest. That is called as the frontal crest. Okay, remember the apex of Fox cerebri is attached to the crista galli and frontal crest, these two parts. Okay, and it has a base. Okay, so the base does not have any bony attachment. It is attached to the superior surface of tentorium cerebelli. Now you can see this yellow colored structure, no? That is the tentorium cerebelli. We'll see about its attachment in parts later. Just now remember it has two surfaces. Whatever you're seeing here is the upper surface of the tent. This tent is present in which cranial fossa? The posterior cranial fossa. That will be separating the cerebrum and cerebellum. So in this region, the tentorium will be there. Okay. So the posterior part or the base is attached to the superior surface of this tent. Okay, remember this tent will have a superior surface here and an inferior surface below. Okay, the Fox cerebri is attached to the superior surface of tentorium cerebelli. The base is attached there. Okay, so that is about, we've seen the apex and the base. Then we'll move on to the border. The upper border is attached to the sagittal suture. Okay, so this is the sagittal suture, no? In the midline, this region between the two parietal bones is the sagittal suture. So the upper border is attached to the sagittal suture, whereas the lower border is free. Okay, and it has two surfaces. You can see that it has two surfaces. A right surface that is related to the right cerebral hemisphere and the left surface that is related to the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so we've seen the two surfaces, right and left surface. We've seen the apex, base as well as the upper border. Now in this image, okay, this purple one represents the Fox cerebri. Okay, it has an apex. This is the apex. Okay, that was attached to the crista galli and frontal crest. It has a base that is attached to the superior surface of tentorium. This yellow is the tentorium cerebelli, and it has a upper border. This is the upper border. Okay, this is related to the sagittal suture, and the lower border is free. This is the lower border that is free. Okay, and it has two surfaces, one on this side and one on the opposite side. Okay, the right and the left surface. So that's about the first dural fold that is called as Fox cerebri. The next dural fold is the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, now this tentorium, it's called so because it is tent shaped. Tent usually forms the roof, no? It forms the roof of cerebellum. So it's called as tentorium cerebelli. Now this forms the roof in the posterior cranial fossa. Remember in the base of the cranial fossa, we divided it into three. Anterior and middle by the lesser wing of sphenoid, and this border. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone that has, it is triangular in cut section. Okay, so if you take a cut section along here, it will appear like this. It will have a superior border, anterior and a posterior border. So the superior border of the petrous temporal bone will separate the cranial fossa into middle and the posterior cranial fossa. And this is present in the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, and we already saw that it separates the cerebellum. These two are the cerebellum. Okay, it separates the cerebellum and the occipital lobe, the posterior lobe. Okay, remember this cranial fossa is related to the frontal lobe This is related to the temporal, and this is related to the, actually related to the bone is the cerebellum. Okay, bellum. So basically there will be the posterior cranial fossa here in this region. Okay, let's assume this to be the bony part of the posterior cranial fossa. Immediately above that we have the cerebellum, and above that we have the tentorium, and further above that we have the occipital lobe. So from below above, posterior cranial fossa in which the cerebellum is resting, and roof of the cerebellum is formed by the tentorium cerebelli. Above that is the occipital lobe. So the two surfaces of tentorium cerebelli are upper and lower surface. The upper surface is related to what structure? To the occipital lobe of cerebrum. The lower surface is related to the cerebellum. Okay. Apart from that, from the upper surface, we also saw another dural fold. What is the dural fold? It is falx cerebri. Now remember, the lower surface also is related to a dural fold that is called as falx cerebelli. Just remember that. We'll see about its details. Okay. So it is present between the cerebellum and occipital lobe. Okay. Thereby it splits the posterior cranial fossa into two compartments. The supratentorial compartment and the infratentorial compartment. What structure is present in the supratentorial compartment? The occipital lobe of cerebrum. In the infratentorial compartment, what is present? The cerebellum. Okay. And we already saw the two surfaces. Okay, superior and inferior surface. Now it has two margins. Okay, the anterior margin is free. Okay, we'll see its shape. It will come around here. Okay, the anterior margin is free. It has no attachment. Whereas the posterior margin is a attached margin. Okay, see, you can see a sulcus here. Okay, that is called as the transverse sulcus. And what is this structure? This is the superior border of the petrous part of temporal bone. Okay, so remember the attached margin is attached to four bones. What are the bones? First I'll list out the bones: the occipital bone, parietal bone, temporal as well as sphenoid. The attached border of the tentorium cerebelli is convex in shape, okay, and it is attached to four bones. Occipital, which part of occipital bone? Transverse sulcus. And which part of parietal bone? It has two angles here that is seen. Totally it has four angles. You're seeing one here. This is the anterosuperior angle. This is the image of the inner aspect of cranial vault, the upper part of the skull. This is the lower part. So the skull is sectioned at this level, okay, and this bone is the upper part, whereas when looked into it, the cranial fossa is this image. Okay, so the four angles of parietal bone are anterosuperior, posterosuperior. This is anteroinferior and posterior-inferior. So which part of the parietal bone? It is related to the posterior-inferior angle of parietal bone. And the next bone is the temporal bone. Which part of temporal bone is it related to? The superior border of petrous part of the temporal bone. And which part of the sphenoid bone? There are four processes, no? Anterior clinoid process and posterior clinoid process. This attached border is attached to the posterior clinoid process. Okay, so we've seen the anterior margin, okay, that is free. We'll see in the image. Posterior margin, two surfaces. Okay, so this you can see here, no? This is the anterior margin. It is free. Okay, whereas the posterior clinoid process, petrous part, posterior-inferior angle and the transverse sulcus. All of this is the attachment of the posterior margin. Okay, the attached margin is posterior and it is convex in shape, whereas the anterior margin is concave. Okay, so this is concave. anterior and free, whereas this is convex, posterior and attached. Okay, the two surfaces, one is present above the superior surface and the other is present below the inferior surface. Okay, so we already saw posterolateral to the transverse sulcus of occipital bone, postero-inferior angle of parietal bone. Anterolaterally, it is attached to the superior border of petrous part of temporal bone and posterior clinoid process of sphenoid. Okay, so this is the attachment of the attached border. You can divide it into posterolaterally two bones and anterolaterally two bones. Okay, the third dural fold that we are seeing is the fox cerebelli. It is called as fox because it is sickle shaped, and it is called as cerebelli because it is present between the two cerebellar hemispheres. Just like the cerebral hemispheres, that is right and left, the cerebellum also two hemispheres are present. Okay, the right and the left cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, it is sickle shaped. And the apex, okay, this is the lower end forms the apex here. Okay, at the apex, it splits into two and goes on the either side of foramen magnum. And the base is related to the inferior surface of tentorium cerebelli. I already mentioned that, no? So, this is the inferior surface, right? So, the base is attached here. So, this is how it will be between the two cerebellum. Okay, so the apex is related to foramen magnum. The apex of fox cerebri was related to crista galli and frontal crest. Okay, and the base of fox cerebelli is related to the inferior surface of tentorium, and the base of fox cerebri is related to the superior surface of tentorium. And what are the two surfaces of this fox cerebelli? The red one is the fox cerebelli. There are two surfaces present, the right and the left surface. So see, you can see that it is attached to the inferior surface of the tentorium. This is the base. Okay, and this is the apex that splits into two and goes on the either side of the foramen magnum. This is the foramen magnum. Okay, and it has two surfaces, right and the left surface. It also has two borders. What are the two borders? This is the posterior border. Okay, that is attached. It is related to internal occipital crest of the bone. Okay, just like how there is an external occipital crest, there is one on the inner surface also. That is called as the internal occipital crest. Okay, so the posterior border is attached and is related to the internal occipital crest. The anterior border is free. So what are all the free borders? For the fox cerebri, it is the inferior border. It is a free border. For the tentorium, the anterior border is free. Okay, for the fox cerebelli, similarly, the anterior border is free. Okay, so these are the free borders of the three dural folds. Now we'll move on to the last dural fold, that is called as the diaphragma sellae. Now it is called as diaphragm because it is circular shape. Okay, and it is called as sellae because it is related to the tuberculum and dorsum sellae that is present in the body of the sphenoid bone. So what are all the parts of sphenoid bone? There is a body and there is a lesser wing as well as a greater wing. Okay, now the diaphragma sellae is circular. It is present as a roof of hypophyseal fossa. So in a cut section along here, okay, there is the tuberculum sellae. There is a fossa here. I'll draw it somewhere else. This is the tuberculum sellae. Okay, there is a fossa that is called as the hypophyseal fossa, and there is a dorsum sellae. Okay, inside this is a gland. What is the gland? The pituitary gland will be situated. Okay, that has a stalk or a connecting structure that goes up. Okay, this is the pituitary gland with its stalk. Now this diaphragma will be attached from the tuberculum sellae to the dorsum sellae. This is the tuberculum and dorsum sellae. Okay, now for the passage of the stalk, it has a foramen present in it, a aperture that allows the passage of the stalk of the pituitary gland. Okay, so let's see where it is present. It is situated here. Okay, that forms the roof of the hypophyseal fossa. It is represented like this, but it is circular. Okay, it forms the roof of the hypophyseal fossa. This is its central aperture. Okay, so the stalk can come out. The stalk of the pituitary gland will come out through that. Okay, so that is about it. Anteriorly, tuberculum sellae, and posteriorly, we have the dorsum sellae. So, what are the dural folds? We have four folds: fox cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, fox cerebelli, and the diaphragma sellae. Okay, related to each of these folds, there are dural venous sinuses. What are the dural venous sinuses? What is the purpose? So that the venous blood in the cranial cavity can be drained into that. Okay, so what is the major drainage of the cranial cavity? The internal jugular vein, right? But the internal jugular vein is formed as a continuation of the dural venous sinuses. So we also have to note, in addition to all these details for every dural fold, we should know that what are the dural venous sinuses related to each fold. Okay, so I'll just give an outline here and then we'll move on to the details. So related to the fox cerebri, in its upper border, there is a dural fold. Okay, sorry, dural sinuses in its upper border. Okay, that is called as the superior sagittal sinus. In the upper border of fox cerebri, the dural venous sinus is called as superior sagittal sinus. Similarly, related to the lower border, there is another sinus that is called as the inferior sagittal sinus. It's called as sagittal because it is situated in the sagittal plane, just below the sagittal suture. Okay, here between these two, between the fox and tentorium, there is another sinus that is called as the straight sinus. Okay, straight sinus. And then we have one related to the either side of the posterior attached part of the tentorium. Okay, so related to fox cerebri, there are three dural sinuses: the superior sagittal, inferior sagittal, and straight sinus. All of these three are unpaired sinuses. They are present in the midline, no, so they are not paired. And related to the tentorium, you can mention the straight sinus related to tentorium also. This is the straight sinus. Okay. On the related to the posterior attached border, we have a sinus called as the transverse sinus. Okay. So there is one on the either side. So they are paired sinuses. That is the transverse sinus. Here related to the attached border. Again on the this part. What is that? The superior border of the petrous part. There you have a sinus called as the superior petrosal sinus. Okay. So this is transverse sinus. This is the superior petrosal sinus. So related to the tentorium, we have the transverse and superior petrosal sinus. Now related to the fox cerebelli, okay, this red structure, in its posterior aspect, you have a sinus that is called as the occipital sinus. Okay, in this region, we have the occipital sinus. Okay, so this will be where the transverse sinus will be, this one. Okay, this is the posterior attached border, no? That is where the transverse sinus will be. So, what are all the sinuses we have seen? The dural venous sinuses. Related to fox cerebri, there are three. All three are unpaired. The superior sagittal, inferior sagittal, and straight. Related to the tentorium, there are two. Okay, the transverse sinus and the superior petrosal sinus. Related to the fox cerebelli, we have the occipital sinus. Now, on either side of the diaphragma sellae, okay, or the body of sphenoid, you have two sinuses here. This is very, very important. This sinuses are called as cavernous sinus, that is extending from the superior orbital fissure in the front to the apex. This is the apex of the petrous part. Okay, to the apex it is present on either side of the body of sphenoid. Okay, these two are called as the cavernous sinus. Now, why is it called as cavernous sinus? Because lot of trabeculae are present inside. Okay, imagine this is a cut section of the cavernous sinus. Lot of trabeculae are present, splitting the entire sinus into lot of smaller rooms or caverns. Okay, that's why it is called as cavernous sinus. Okay, so these are the sinuses that are related to the dural folds. What is the function of these sinuses? They will drain the blood from the contents of the cranium, that is the brain. Okay, parts of the brain. And we'll see about each of the sinuses in the next part.